is it?
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it? I'm the Doctor. Only joking.
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
Only joking.
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
Small off-duty Czechoslovakian traffic warden.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
Only joking.
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
Alright dudes, it's time for another episode of It's Time to Rewind. I'm known as Bubbawheat. Not the Bubbawheat, not first name Bubba, last name Wheat, just Bubbawheat. This season is Red Who, where I'm covering British sci-fi like Red Dwarf and Doctor Who, and joining me 3 million years in the future via the TARDIS is my guest, Dave Babbitt. How are you doing today?
I'm quite well. Yourself?
I am doing pretty good. It's good to be in, the real time loopiness of this season. It's, I've been focusing, for a long time on entire episodes, but, it's nice to get back to the kind of minutia breakdown of, just dealing with a 6-minute scene. And, speaking of which, we are still in the main section of this season with the 2022 New Year's Eve special, Eve of the Daleks, with the 13th Doctor Jodie Whittaker. And on this episode, we are covering the second loop that starts at 9 minutes and 51 seconds, with Sarah and Nick being confused next to a Monopoly game, and ends at 16 minutes and 26 seconds, with the Doctor, Dan, and Yaz getting killed, or getting exterminated yet again.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, but before we get into this, this is your first time on this season, so, I know you recently released an episode on your show about Doctor Who, and so I reached out, but what is your kind of, brief history with the show?
To keep it as brief as I can, my introduction to Doctor Who, of all things, was the 1996 made-for-TV movie. Back when it originally aired on Fox. Like, I'm Canadian there, but I live close enough to the border that we were getting Detroit signals there. And I kid you not, I watched it because I was doing homework at the time. I turned it on, and at first I thought I was looking at an ad for a made-for-TV Doctor Strange film when you have Eric Roberts walking down to the Time Lord robes, and it's like, oh, wait, what? How did I miss the existence of this? I'm going to watch. I understood very quickly I was wrong, but I really enjoyed it, particularly Sylvester McCoy. In that opening 20-minute segment, they really made an impression. But it was like, that's what made me familiar and got me introduced. But again, not easy access to the old show. To be able to go back and visit it at that time. However, once the new series arrived in the 2005, that's when I got full-blown hooked on things and started going back and rewatching the original series thanks to its availability on DVD. And it became, needless to say, my all-time favorite television program from that point forward. So,
yeah, and, this, as far as the new series, do you kind of have a favorite Doctor, and kind of what's your brief thoughts on the Jodie Whittaker run?
Favorite Doctor, honestly, yeah, I'll put it this way: the best actor to have ever played this role is Peter Capaldi. I think at this point, he, I think, just really defines the role in a way. Even when watching him during his first run, I really wasn't cognizant of at the time. But as I said, Sylvester McCoy's that. Again, he's only in 20 minutes of that made-for-TV movie, but it imprinted on me. And I love going back and watching his era of the show. I mean, which I will say, it's not the best era for the show, because obviously the BBC was pretty much doing everything in its power to kill it at that point. We're not going to kick in extra money. We're not going to give you extra funds. We're going to be putting you on the worst slot of the week there in this case. But I love McCoy's take, and listening to things like the audio dramas and that, and getting him to get some really great material. I do love his interpretation of the Doctor.
My experience with his Doctor, other than I did also watch the movie. But I believe it was Remembrance of the Daleks, and
yes,
that was, I thought it was interesting because the first episode he kind of put me off, but then he over the course of the four parts, I kind of, he won me over the course of that, because I thought he was like really very like know-it-all-y in the first part.
Yeah.
And then he kind of softened as that serial went on, and of course, I absolutely loved Ace in that. She was fantastic.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, I mean, his Doctor, like the consistency of the writing during that period, like he starts off very goofy at the start there, and deliberately so to be a contrast to what they saw as the too much darkness of Colin Baker, excluding his costume, of course. There, but like. Again, I think when McCoy really gets to play the humanity of the character, he does it exceptionally well. As far as your question about Whittaker here, I really love Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor in this case. I think she gives a phenomenal performance in the role. The Chris Chibnall era as a whole, I think it's way better than its detractors like to give it credit for, but it is probably the most flawed of the modern era in this case there. And I think part of it is navigating, obviously, behind the scenes shenanigans with the BBC's budgets there. Obviously, the misogyny that was thrown towards Whittaker during her time did not help in any way, shape, or form here there. So it was definitely, but I think it's one of those eras that, particularly as time goes on, people are going to look back and be extremely, extremely fond of in this case.
Yeah, I kind of hear that, to a certain extent quite a bit. So, a lot of people that I talked to, they thought that Jodie Whittaker was fantastic, but Chibnall was not so much.
Yeah, Chibnall is he is such a divisive figure. I think I was very interested. Stephen Moffat recently gave a comment where he referred to being the head of Doctor Who as basically being like the Pope of the series. It's like you are both you are basically there to be the blame for everything in this case there. And I do think that's the thing. Like Chibnall, he has his weaknesses as a writer. And be clear, there are some weak episodes during his run, but I also do think that he went in with a lot of good intentions, and I also think, he did give the show some swift kick in certain areas that it kind of needed, in terms of, again, a woman leading the show was long overdue by this point, and it had been an idea that had been bandied about since the mid-'80s. So, like I said, kudos to him on finally delivering on what should have been there for a long, long time there.
Yeah. And, I guess we'll jump into this loop, which I do love that this loop does start out mid-sentence. I think that's kind of a something that doesn't tend to happen a lot. I feel like a lot of times, time loops have this adjustment period where it's kind of starts calm, and then it kind of lulls you into a false sense of complacency. And this one is it's right mid-sentence, right, what's you just saw 10 minutes ago, if you're counting commercials. And this is a time loop, and it's like, that this is what it is, and it has this sense of kind of not dread, I guess, this slight horror-esque bent to it, where it's like the episode is telling you that something is weird going on, but there's not really any explanation, and the characters, they're kind of aware of it, but they're also still kind of going through the motions of what happened in the last loop.
Well, exactly there. It's, again, it's surprising, looking over the history of the show, that it hadn't done the time loop sooner than it did here in this case.
But again, at least not a true full-on Groundhog Day style loop. There have definitely been time loops. I mean, I've covered several of them this season. Just not in this format. But most of the time, the time loop is either a minimal part of the episode, or I think the closest one is, Capaldi's Heaven Sent, where
exactly.
It's, he's repeating it, but in terms of the way it's shot, the vast majority is the first iteration, and then the rest of it is kind of a montage.
Well, that's the thing, because the beauty of that one is it's a time loop where the character only figures that out so late in the game and then weaponizes it all to their advantage in a way that this one, because they become aware of it so early in the episode, and there's so much more of a time crunch compared to Heaven Sent in this case there, that it's really sort of, it gives it such a different flavor there. And again, part of it also, with credit to Chibnall, that they are clearly aware that audiences are going to pick up on the fact that it's a time loop very, very quickly. They're able to use a great deal of shorthand there with the awareness that the audience is going to be a little ahead of the curve as well on this one.
Yeah, and one other thing that we get fairly early on is we get a close-up of Sarah's phone with the time predominantly displayed is 23:52. And I can't believe I didn't talk about the time on the phone. We talked about the shrinking time loops, but I completely forgot to kind of focus on the time displayed on the phone. So I did go back, and the first time that we actually see the phone in the episode is very early on, before Nick shows up, and it shows 23:48. Which that makes sense, but then I did notice a continuity error, because much later in the episode we see her phone very briefly and it says 23:51.
Yeah, and the thing this also brings it to maybe the one weakness of this episode is that the consistency, that time is very malleable. When we say
it's wibbly wobbly.
Yeah, exactly. It's a time loop that works through dramatically there. If you try and parse out the logic exactly of how they pull everything off within the increasingly shorter time frames, it does stretch credibility in that way. To that, I say, who cares? It works dramatically. I'm all in on it there.
Yeah, I'll definitely be talking about that in the later loops, because even just breaking it up by the amount of time that each loop takes on screen, it's not it's very inconsistent to how the time loop physically works with the shrinking 1 minute each iteration.
Yeah, exactly there. But this is, I guess, here's one thing here. I don't know if you, in your previous episodes, have spent time much talking about the characters of Sarah and Nick itself. At this point, what do you make of them as far as sort of our primary guest characters, and really what the central focus of this episode kind of is actually about, more so than the Doctor and the TARDIS crew this time?
Yeah, I did, talk a bit about them in the last episode, where it really feels like it's their episode. It kind of reminds me a bit of Blink, where in Blink the Doctor was the secondary character in the episode, and then the one-off human character is really the main character of the episode, and I feel like that's true in this one as well. Yeah, and I like Ashlyn B as Sarah. I think she kind of plays this, this person that does not want to be here, and Johnny Salmon as Nick. I think his character is an interesting. I definitely feel like neurodivergent vibes from him, and I think he plays the potentially stalkerish serial killer character as the lovable, lovelorn, pining away for his crush that he apparently only sees once a year, which again is kind of insane whenever you think about how this relationship is described in this episode.
Well, that's a really great fine line, I think, that Chibnall walks in the script, because this could very easily be a very toxic presentation if it goes wrong in this case here there. But yeah, Nick really does walk that fine line where it's it's not stalkery in the same sense. You get the feeling it's I best hold on to these things. There is a rationale, and you get the feeling he does absolutely believe in that in this episode. Aisling B, though, what impresses me is her willingness to really take Sarah up to the incredibly unlikable in this thing unapologetically. Like, there is no real, like, when she goes for broke in the scene, which we'll get to very momentarily in this segment of the episode, like, yeah, they don't sugarcoat how cruel she can be when she lets her anger overtake her in this case. And I'm very impressed by that in terms of just, it's like, yeah, we're not concerned about that we're going to lose the audience, quote unquote, from being on her side because of that. It makes her a much more complicated and interesting dynamic throughout this episode.
Yeah, especially like in this scene, you know, the first time around, she was definitely standoffish to Nick.
Yeah.
And this second time around, she is very snippy with him.
Yeah. And like I said, yeah, like completely, you know, self, like once they have this moment here where they run into each other, in this case, or, oh no, sorry, that's in the next segment.
Yeah,
like him going.
Yeah, it's the next one because in this one we, you know,
he rushes back to save her. And finds that she's already taken off in her desperate attempt to find some other way to escape or
a weapon. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, just needs something there. And again, tells you everything you need to know about the dynamic of these characters at this point.
Yeah, because, you know, for Nick, Sarah is this unrequited crush that he comes in to see every year because he knows that Jeff is going to flake out and cause her to work on New Year's Eve, which, you know, they, again, like trying to comprehend how he figured that out over the course of however many years he's been coming here. It's, again, it's, you know, just kind of ignore the setup and just deal with the characters. And
exactly.
And I think that moment whenever he, you know, he has the flash of memory where he remembers getting killed by the Dalek and his first instinct is to go and save Sarah. You know, that I think it definitely goes a long way towards endearing the audience towards him as a character. And I think, again, alternately, you know, immediately cutting from that moment to Sarah, you know, looking at the elevator and getting her flash of the Dalek, and then her first instinct is to escape, which she can't escape because there's a force field, and then her second instinct is to go find a weapon.
Yeah.
And has absolutely zero thought for Nick because, you know, why would she? He's just a customer to her, and that makes perfect sense whenever you kind of take a step back and look at this from her perspective.
Now, here's the question for you. So is Jeff basically running illegal stuff for the mob, do we think? Like, I'm just looking at this collection, like this seems like just the weirdest, most random jumble of stuff that it feels like trucks were hijacked at some point, and this is all the useless junk that the criminals had no use for, it seems, because, like, the beans. Why the beans?
Yeah, I think that Jeff is such a fascinating character in this episode, even though he never appears on screen. His only appearance is, you know, she's talking to Jeff, and we don't even hear his side of the conversation. We only hear Sarah's side of the conversation when she's talking to Jeff.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, they create such a personality for Jeff. Just, you know, he's like the Maris of this episode.
Exactly. Just like, and honestly, you know, this could have been like a great occasional running gag through this era if it had come up much sooner in the series. Jeff is just this mysterious figure who people seem to be connected by, but it's always under the weirdest of circumstances of whatever he's up to. So, you know, backseat quarterbacking from the over here in Canada a number of years after the fact, but still. But yeah, I guess with that, I guess this brings us to the Doctor and her confrontation with the Daleks here. Now, I guess this is, I guess to put this in the overall context of the Chibnall era itself, like the Daleks only ever really appeared in the holiday specials, in this case, and the New Year specials in particular, minus the Power of the Doctor finale, where they're not really the predominant threat in that one at all. They're just sort of like, hey, everybody's showing up at this point, so we got to have you here. What do you think of Chibnall's handling of the Daleks overall during this sort of trinity of episodes?
Well, I mean, this is the only Chibnall era episode that I've seen.
Okay.
This is my first. This was my very first Doctor Who episode, and then shortly after this came out, I talked it, a bit last week, so I won't go too far into it again. But and then after watching this, I went back and started with Christopher Eccleston. And then, I've been, very slowly, I took a couple years off, and then I jumped back again starting this season. And right now I am almost through Matt Smith's second season.
Oh, okay. Oh, so you got a ways to go there to get this. Okay, yeah. I was going to say, because maybe it's interesting, because on one hand, I appreciate that Chibnall did not, during the Russell T Davies first era, and then certainly the Daleks were the big bad. They were always guaranteed, and almost always popped up in a season finale or major event episode in this case. And as far as the Whittaker era, the Daleks were much more sparingly used. They popped up once a year in these specials, but they were much more low-key stories compared to how they traditionally get brought out. Really, this boils down to Dalek Hit Squad pops up in this episode just to kill the Doctor. There is no greater plan in this episode whatsoever for them, which kind of makes it remarkably low scale compared to maybe the only other one being again the first Christopher Eccleston Dalek story, Dalek, where it's just one Dalek going on a murder spree in the underground tunnels in the near future of, I think it was 2012, if I remember that episode correctly. How time flies. But it's just very, very curious, because his treatment was I think he struggled. When you get to those first two New Year's specials, Resolution, is solid. It's fine there. It does a few things that are interesting, but it's a solid enough episode. The second one there is a much, much weaker episode. I won't spoil it for you when you get to that. So, but I feels like this is the one where Chibnall really hit his stride. It's oh, okay, this is what a Dalek story can be. This is what a New Year's special should be there. And unfortunately, it came a little bit towards the end of his run, figuring it out. But still, c'est la vie.
Yeah, I think what this episode does do pretty well is it sets them up as very good enemies. They start off as scary.
Yeah.
And effective. They start off as scary and effective. That was the word I was looking for. And then we don't get the silliness until about halfway through the episode.
Exactly. Yeah. No, 100% there. What about the TARDIS team itself? What do you make of, oh God, why am I blanking? Yaz and Dan. Sorry.
Yeah. It's tough for me to really get too much into them as characters because of, like we already talked about, the trio is really kind of sidelined in this episode, and they're secondary characters. And even though we get a kind of a big storyline reveal moment in this episode, set up by Dan,
yeah,
we don't get a ton of personality because, I feel like Dan kind of has the most personality out of the three of them, because he does get the one-on-one moment with the Dalek. Again, with the silliness of him running circles around the Dalek, avoiding its gun stock. But Yaz and the Doctor are really, their main focus in this episode is just problem solving. They're just focused on the solution to the problem, so we don't get a ton of character details between either of them.
Yeah, and definitely one thing I would definitely be interested to see when you eventually get to the proper start of this area is seeing how the companions are handled, because I think Chibnall, Yaz is the much like Fraser Hines back in the original series playing Jamie, Yaz almost entirely, is entirely with this Doctor from start to finish. Basically, there it is. So the consistent companion throughout this era there. And she gets some interesting character development over there, but it takes them a little while to figure out what their angle on her is. It shifts a few times over the course of it. The other problem was this was the one era where there were 4 companions for most of it up until John Bishop came in as Dan. There they cut it down to 3, and you could tell they were struggling. Okay, when the cast gets this big, what do we do in this case? Because we still have guest characters, we still have things we need to do storyline, and usually it felt like at least one of the main cast was sort of getting short shrift throughout most of those early 2 seasons.
Yeah, I think in terms of the cast, where I am is still primarily just the one companion, and whenever they introduced Rory, there's, it's a cast of 3. I think that works well because, Rory has this strong connection to Amy.
Yeah.
And so I think that, so it's still kind of one companion because it's Rory and Amy. It's not Rory and then also Amy.
Yeah, their stuff's all tied together and not 3 competing things of that nature. Yeah, and that's definitely, again, I think one of the reasons why now that Russell T Davies is back for his second era running the show, it's we're back to Doctor and one companion. Boom, that's it. We are not going to be going past that often, if at all, during his run in this case. And I see the logic of it there. You don't want to overwhelm the cast there, but I do like a nice trio overall when they provide it there.
Yeah, and jumping back a little bit, I do like how the Doctor and the 2 companions, they work out so that they're in a time loop much more quickly. They're they have the first line, "Oh, I thought this was the beach," out of habit, and then their very next line is, "Didn't we get it exterminated?" And then,
yeah. Let's just cope with death really meekly or mildly here, which, again, I mean, is interesting in how it's this could be a much heavier episode if they really wanted to focus on that, but I think the wise call, New Year's Day viewing, maybe not the time for death trauma, related trauma, to be the primary focus of your big special, but...
Yeah, and then... Say jumping, I think, back to where we were. Let's go to where Nick is down at the lobby looking for Sarah. He has his interaction with the force field.
Yeah,
and he sees Sarah on the security camera. And we don't hear it. He just says she's up on the whatever floor.
Yeah.
And then he goes to catch up to her yet again, and then he's faced with the Dalek, and again, it's, very quick that the Dalek just has one line, which I didn't write down what it was, and then the Dalek just kills him, just within a very brief interaction, again, making them very effective and scary at this part in the episode.
Yeah. Exactly. And cutting from his death to the shot of Sarah looking through the ripped up tarp, there is something very iconically horror image, as a way to almost evoke the body in a shroud, even though it's a completely separate character. But that's that sort of underlying idea in terms of the edit, is really effectively done there.
Yeah. And we also get the crime scene tape where Jeff has taped off this entire floor of the storage unit.
Yeah.
And I love that, his sign is taped up and written on a piece of cardboard. And it's very, it has so much character because it says Jeff stuff, keep out.
Yeah.
And there's, exclamation points on every single sentence. Temporary storage only. You said it was okay, Sarah. Remember, on that Tuesday.
Exactly. just simultaneously a little bit too childish, but also very detail oriented. Just so.
Yeah.
God.
And then we get to see, she goes into three of his storage units, and the first one is just filled with taxidermy animals. And again, leaning into the horror elements, we just see this bear and this leopard,
Yeah.
and these big cats, and then we get the kind of the full view of the room, and it's literally just an entire storage unit filled with taxidermy animals, ceiling to floor.
Yeah, exactly. Which just brings everything back to this. What are you into, Jeff? What is going on in your life that resulted in this?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's both Ashlyn and Johnny do well is they're talking to themselves, aka talking to the audience.
Yeah.
Feels very natural.
Yes. There. And I think that also comes back to the things his social awkwardness lends itself to those moments of things where it's that's probably just something he does every day regardless. There it does feel authentic. And again, with B in the role of Sarah, again, this is someone who clearly likes to talk or feels the need to talk and just let everything out there. Otherwise, she probably would explode more so than she currently does.
Yeah, and she gets the line, come on, Jeff, no animals, living or dead.
Yeah.
And then the second storage unit, it looks like a party tree threw up in there.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then of course the beef and bean third storage unit.
Oh, well, and also I didn't want to jump over her comment on that one is, she gets the probably stolen.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly. So, oh god.
Yeah, and then the third one is like a doomsday prepper's paradise.
Exactly.
And I get the feeling, and almost to me it's so kind of perfect. It almost looks like a matte painting. I'm curious if they actually used cans for all this, or if it was just a kind of a facade for some of it, even potentially a digital facade on the side racks, because it's five shelves high.
Yeah.
Lining each wall, and then a center one, and which visually I think it's nice visually, because it blocks, it's centered on the frame, and then our vision of the back of the storage unit is blocked by this center shelf.
Yeah.
And so it helps give the impression that this storage unit goes on forever.
Yeah, exactly. The depth of field there is just phenomenally well done there. And I mean, I would suspect, probably at least the first few shelves are definitely real, where at least real in the sense that there's a physical item there. I doubt they're, I would imagine it might even be hollow on the inside, and it's just a mass of cans that have been strung together to give the impression of being an entire shelf of them. But
yeah, and then she gets her interaction.
Yeah.
And well, I guess right before that, we do get our only time loop marker, from here on out, because again, this whole setup of the time loop works a bit differently, because it's almost more like a time travel than a real time loop, except for her mother, who is kind of outside of the effective area, because everybody that's going through this time loop keeps their memories, and so outside of the first the first minute or so in this loop, from here on out, they're all immediately aware that they're in a time loop after this, and so there is no real repetition except for this phone call, which happens at 4 minutes to the bongs.
Yeah, exactly there. And again, I do love, like, as far as smart setup there, the mother not being used to the fact that it's a digital network now. It does not have the same overload capacity that old landlines did back once upon a time. It's a nice sort of little touch there that clearly has a plot function, but storytelling function for the audience as far as a marker goes, but is incredibly fun, regardless. Or it is a sort of a very true detail, I should say, regardless.
Yeah. And then I feel like this is kind of the moment in the episode where Sarah kind of wins the audience. At least she won me over as a character, where she is confronting this Dalek and just like basically telling him to shoo. It's like, this is my property. You're trespassing, so go on now, shoo.
It's a very Jackie Tyler moment, as it goes, and it works so well. This case where it's like, it's ultimately defined, and you're right. I mean, it's like you get the sympathy. It's like she is trying. She is definitely, this is circumstances outside her control, but she's not letting that, change who she is, or she's not going to go down cowering before this thing. There's phenomenal. And that brings us, of course, to the Doctor and co. finally arriving.
Well, before that, I did want to mention, this is kind of really the first moment in the episode where we get much we got a little bit in the first loop with the Dalek talking to the Doctor, where that was all pretty much just one-upsmanship.
Yeah.
Very much like, I'm disabling your weapon with my sonic screwdriver. Yeah. Oh, but we know about that, and we have anti-sonic screwdriver capabilities now.
Yeah, exactly.
And then here we get the moment where she's she has this bravado, and the Dalek replies with elevated fear levels detective.
Yeah.
And she has the moment to, well, of course.
Yeah.
Like, what do you expect?
Daleks, well-known conversationalists they are. Here. And then, this brings us, to them arriving. And I do love the one exchange, which on one hand does feel a little mean-spirited when Yaz goes along with it, when the Dalek refers to Dan as the inferior human in this moment. It just is like offensive. She's like, well, it is a smart Dalek in that way. Just like okay, that's like a little mean-spirited, but especially given that, which I guess you could sit there and say is what might bother some audiences. Like, again, they are experiencing death over and over again. It's like, you'd think they might be a bit more experiencing some degree of existential dread, maybe a bit more so than they are, since you're not necessarily sure you're going to come back again after this, but...
Yeah, and I think this is also kind of an interesting moment too, and again, this kind of tells the audience about the Dalek superiority in this episode specifically. It sets them up as a very formidable foe, where the Doctor is like, the Daleks are ahead of us, and the Dalek appears and it's like, yes we are.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, no, of course. Here. And again, I do love how small the Dalek's plan is in this episode. Like, it literally is the most cut and dry, simple thing. It's like, hey, opportunity here. Like, we were hanging above the Earth waiting to invade, so we got to get out of the time loop in order to stop, the invasion or some stuff like that. I mean, we've seen that a million times, and honestly, the best Dalek stories are when they just really get to be little monsters, doing petty, horrible things along these lines, where it's like, we know what the big things are. There's no real shock in that anymore. It's like, once you get into the minutiae of what little jerks they're going to be, in this case, that's where the real fun with them starts to kick in there. Even going back again to Russell T. Davis era part 1, when the Daleks and the Cybermen basically have their little standoff. Basically, the Daleks, cannot help themselves from boasting. It's like, look, the only thing you're better at than us is dying. So we're just going to get on with that. Like, those little personality quirks I do enjoy, but...
Yeah, and I'll get into it a bit more, but this episode again, I said it last week, but I think I'm glad that this is kind of a high point. I feel like this episode was kind of a high point in the Chibnall era.
Yeah.
Luckily, this is a good episode to really break down into 9 parts, and that the Dalek threat really, it starts strong and then it ramps up well before it kind of, it falls back down again.
Well, I think this speaks also to Chibnall's strength as a writer. Like, the areas he tends to fall down in is more complicated long-form plotting. Like, it's weird to say because, Russell T. Davis, tended to keep, whatever sort of recurring elements in that very simple and straightforward. A word keeps following us all through time. And then really that pays off in, 2 episodes that are very closely tied, but you really don't need that for the rest of the season, or to have seen the other stuff in order to understand those episodes. And then you have Moffat, who was Mr. Complicated, and there will be multiple balls juggling in the air. And most of the time, he could pull it all together and pay off that stuff in this case. Chibnall...
Yeah, I just, again, jumping back to where I am, I just kind of got the, where River Song came from.
Yeah.
And I think that is, I'm not fully sold on it. I think it's done pretty well, but I think there's also a little bit where I was kind of with it. But, I'm not quite done with her story, I guess. I think she's, I was kind of surprised that she didn't have as many episodes as I expected. I think she only has 1 or 2 more episodes after this.
Yeah, her Matt Smith's second year is probably the era where she plays the biggest role. During that season, she'll pop up the most. Then she has a few times after the fact, without spoiling things, particularly once you get into the Capaldi era there. But she definitely drifts off a bit more after that. But even with Moffat, something that's happened episode 1 of his season, and that'll pay off a year and a half down the line, or 2 seasons down the line, or
again, River Song showed up with David Tennant first.
Exactly.
And then she didn't get paid off until Matt Smith's second season.
Exactly. So with all of that involved, Chibnall, there are points where you see him trying to do that kind of long form plotting. Immediately before this is the 6-part Flux season, which is one long ongoing storyline throughout it, with Chibnall writing a large chunks of it. And it's probably the strongest overall season he did. But there are even things story points that would be, you think and sit there, it's wait, that needs a bit more setup, or that should be, there needs to be a lot more of an emotional payoff. He struggles a bit to land those moments. Whereas here, the story is so stripped down and straightforward, it just lets him play to those strengths of what's some good character writing, what's some fun dynamics that can go. Because, long form plotting and big scale invasion or destruction storylines were definitely not his strong suit during that era. So...
and then I think really the last note that I have for this loop is, we kind of touched on the pacing of the format for this entire loop, where it shrinks a minute each time. And I think even though this loop is 6.5 minutes of screen time versus the 8 minutes of, real time from 11:52 to midnight, I think it does work on this level, because the mom calls at, she calls at 4 minutes to midnight, and then she actually does call 4.5 minutes into this episode, which would be the correct timing for it being 11:56 at night. And then even though it ends a minute and a half early, I think you could argue that the Doctor and Dan and Yaz didn't get killed right at midnight. They got killed a minute and a half early.
Yes. Well, I think that this brings the other interesting thing about this episode. Partly why I think they get away with sort of the time manipulation is the space of this warehouse is a little ill-defined, and not necessarily in a bad way. Like, there's enough of a geography that we're able to mostly follow what floor people are on or at what point. The sheer scope and size of this building, however, and how long it takes to get from one to another, like, they definitely feel like they're playing with how long does it take to run down the stairs, how long does the elevator take to go, just how deep do some of these corridors in here go. Like, I strongly suspect like this is a real building they shot in this case. Whether it's an actual storage unit or not, I would have to assume it probably was, because I don't think this is built on BBC sets from the looks of it there. If not, they did a bang-up job of giving it that sort of grime lived-in reality to it there. Like, it does not come off as a set.
Yeah, I mean, they're looking at the elevator. There is 10 floors,
yeah.
And that's, I believe there's 2 basement floors, so this is like an 8-story building with 2 basement floors.
Yeah, exactly. So you get the sense where it's like, okay, there must be, if things don't quite work out, there's where that dramatic license comes into. It's like, okay, if you squint, you can probably imagine why it took them a little longer this time or a little bit shorter to get from where they were going to another location in this case. Doesn't necessarily explain why it takes Daleks weaponry a lot of time to get through a storage shed door later on, but that's not this clip. So we'll put that aside for now.
But I think that does it for this loop. Do you have anything else to say about this loop or this episode?
Like I said, I mean, if you're going through and watching, like, to me, this is the best of the holiday specials that Chibnall wrote. I'm not sure why I don't know if they ever came right out and said why they weren't doing Christmas. I always kind of suspected that they switched to New Year because it was more of Doctor Who's a time travel show. Time fits in with this. And again, given, I think, the general sense I get from Chibnall, I think he was looking for something non-denominational necessarily to make it a bit more open and accessible for all and not always constantly have the idea of Christmas hanging in the background there. Something, and again, Moffat and Davis had absolutely no problem with whatsoever there. But I think, like, this is the one that brings it all together. This is him at the height of his powers as far as that goes. And again, like, the other thing I'll say about the Whittaker era, this era is probably the easiest just to grab an episode and watch as well. In this case, like, you literally can walk into this particular episode and know nothing going into it, and you'll be perfectly fine in this case. Like, as long as it's like, boom, Doctor, companions, that's it. That's all you need to know. You're fine otherwise, if you've not watched any Doctor Who to jump in on this one. So...
Yeah, and as someone who literally did just that, I think that this episode worked for me as my first introduction to Doctor Who.
Excellent. So there we go. We have the proper testimonial here, folks.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. And why don't you take a moment and let people know where else you can be found online?
These days you can find me on Blue Sky at 24 panels on there. Beyond, but again, I post very irregularly. I'm this close to leaving Twitter/X. In this case, I've kept it going only as sort of to occasionally lurk in the background, but I do not use it much in all these days. And you can still listen to episodes of Film Strips, the podcast that I co-host there. Episodes may eventually come back on a regular basis. We will see how this goes. Like I said, but I'll put it this way, 5 years of doing a weekly episode pretty much every week. We hung in there for a good long time without burning out completely. So I take that as a win, but...
Yeah, that's, longer than a lot of people.
Yeah. So, well, thank you very much for having me on here. It was much appreciated.
Absolutely. And as always, you can find me everywhere on social media where I'm at Bubbawheat. These days, I am primarily most active on Threads, but I do have accounts on Blue Sky and Twitter, where I'm not active, but, I do still have the app on my phone, and, I will respond to notifications whenever they pop up. But outside of that, mainly, just Threads these days, and a little bit of Instagram, I guess, as well. And we do also have a Facebook group. It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group, and you can join that and get episodes and discuss episodes as they come out, and also be notified when new episodes come out, and see, what the plan is for future seasons whenever I decide on what I'm going to be covering for future seasons. And occasionally I'll even put it up to polls, which, I think, we're kind of in the back half of this season. So if you do want to, help decide what I'm going to be covering for my next season, I probably will have some sort of poll on the Facebook group. So if you'd like to join that and help direct this podcast for its next season, then we'd love to see more people there. And till next time, smoke me a kipper, and I'll regenerate before breakfast next week.